What's up, guys? Nate Dog FPV here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Rad-X. Yeah, so this is the Rad-X frame from Quadbox. This actually came in the April Quadbox. Wasn't really expecting this frame, but hey, got a new frame, might as well do a build on it. So I tried to use some components I had laying around in the parts bin, picked up a couple new things for it. So far it's been a great build, really loving it. I did decide to do like a full build video for this one, so we're checking out the finished product here, but we will see the whole build process and setup process. So of course the frame is the Rad-X by Quadbox. For motors we've got the 2400 kV Sam Gook series from DYS. These have been pretty popular motors lately. Actually only $10 a piece, so they've been I think popular because of the price. But they really don't fly like $10 motors at all. I've been really impressed with them. They feel really solid, really good. So probably going to do a full review on those by themselves. But yeah, so far they've been awesome. For ESCs, we've got some SpeedX 20 amp ESCs. Just taped on the arms there. So again, those are great. SpeedX ESCs have always been great for me, last a long time. For the camera, we've got a Foxeer Aero Micro. And again, that's pretty much the camera I use on all my builds now. The picture quality is just awesome. I haven't found a better camera with a better picture quality, and they're only 20 bucks. So if you break one, it's not the end of the world. Just grab another one. So again, love those cameras. We've got some 3D printed camera holders on there. And again, the ones that came with the quad box were actually green. I just printed some black ones because I wanted some to be a little bit shorter. But yeah, that's what those are. For standoffs, I actually did not use the ones that came with the frame. Quadbox included some 30mm standoffs with it, and I actually wanted to make the build a little more low profile, so I actually switched it out with some blue 20mm standoffs, and again, that just kind of matches the camera and the motors and everything. But yeah, it turned out really clean, I think. It's a nice little low profile build. We've also got the Rotor Riot skids on the bottom. This actually came in one of the quad boxes a few months ago. Haven't really got around to using them yet because most of my quads are bottom mount battery, so I don't really need them. But of course this frame is designed to be a top mount battery, so I'm using the skids on this one. For a flight controller, we've got the Maytech F405 CTR. So that's actually an all-in-one flight controller. It's kind of Maytech's second attempt at an all-in-one. I'm sure most people have heard of the Maytech F405 all-in-one. Their first one was absolute crap. Had tons of twitching issues. If you didn't have like 2,000 caps on your quad, a lot of people had problems with them. There was like a whole Facebook group with nothing but problems with that flight controller. I actually still have one myself in the parts bin that I'm not using because it just twitches all over the place. I could put it in a build right now. I guarantee you as soon as you armed it would be twitching, and y'all twitching all over the place. So just a bad design on that flight controller. The gyro they put in there was not good. It was too sensitive. So it is what it is. So that's just going to be in the parts bin forever probably. I do use it occasionally. Maybe if I need to flash some ESCs or something like that, I can do it through that board. But again, definitely not going to be flying that one again. But so far, this new version, the Maytech F405 CTR, has been awesome. I haven't had any problems with it. Setup was easy, no twitching issues. Maytech put the right gyro on it this time. Also has a barometer, which is something the first one didn't have. So far it's been great. Notice on my XT60, I didn't mount it directly to the board. I put a little bit of 12 gauge wire there and just stuck it up, had it sticking up a little bit. And the main reason for that, I don't want to break the flight controller or break that part off the flight controller that sticks out. A lot of people have had that problem, especially in a crash or something like that. If your battery tries to eject, it can put a lot of pressure on that. So again, just add a little bit of wire there, and that'll give it some support. Still a good strong XT60 connection, but I don't have to worry about it breaking my flight controller. For the receiver, we've got the FlySky, I believe it's the i6B or X6B receiver. Again, the main reason I'm using that is because I have like 3 or 4 of them laying around in the parts bin. I started off with FlySky and eventually, of course, moved to FrSky. I use the Tyrannus QX7 as my controller or transmitter. But I also have the iRange X module, so I can run any receiver really. So again, I decided to just throw the FlySky one in this one. I can still bind it to my Tyrannus with that module, and again, they work just as well. One of the nice things about that one too is it's stackable. Also goes on your flight controller stack, so that kind of worked out great in this build because I wanted it to be low profile. So it does fit right on top of the flight controller and still gives me plenty of room. For VTX, we've got the AKK X1. This is not one of their fanciest VTXs. It doesn't have smart audio or anything like that, but really for this build, I didn't need all that. So pretty simple, but hey, it's got a button to change the channels. Can do 25 to I believe 600 milliwatts. So still a great VTX. In my opinion, AKK VTXs have always been great. So that's what that is. And then we've also got an LED on the back there. That's actually the one they call the flashbang. So it has 8 LEDs on there on a rectangle board. Thinking about maybe doing like a tail light at some point and putting it, back here behind the quad. Probably have to 3D print some kind of mount for that, so I haven't got around to it yet. So right now I've just got it zip tied up in there. But that's pretty much the build, guys. So again, I think it turned out really clean. Really been enjoying flying this quad and ripping it around. So we're going to cut to the build video, watch the whole build process, and of course at the end we'll have some flight footage as well. But again, yeah, this is a Rad-X frame from Quadbox. Hope you enjoy.
Alright guys, so here we go with the build video. Step 1, we're going to do our parts inventory. So the frame is the Rad-X from Quadbox. This came in the April Quadbox. Here's our frame. We've got some 20mm standoffs instead of the 30mm that came with it, trying to make this a low profile build. We've got our screws there for our flight controller stack. Those are actually M3 screws, metal screws. I've used plastic before but had issues with them coming loose, so I prefer to do a metal screw all the way through the stack. And then we've got some tape there on the arms as well to protect our ESCs. There's the ESCs. We're going to be using some SpeedX 20 amp ESCs. Our flight controller there is going to be the Maytech F405 CTR, kind of like Maytech's version 2 of their all-in-one flight controller. We've got the capacitor that they included for the flight controller. Camera is going to be a Foxeer Aero Micro. Again, love those cameras, use those on most of my builds now. We've got a buzzer. For the VTX, we're going to be going with the AKK X1. I got several of these laying around, so the main reason I'm using it on this build. For the receiver there, we're going to be going with the FlySky X6B. And again, main reason I'm using this is because I have several of them laying around. Also have the iRange X module in my Tyrannus, so I can still buy my Tyrannus QX7 to the FlySky receiver as well. So it doesn't really hurt me to use it. And I like that it's stackable, so that should work out well with this low profile build. We're going to be adding in a LED also. They call this one the Flashbang. So it just has 8 LEDs on a rectangle board there. Also can be controlled through your flight controller. For motors, we're going with some DYS Samgook 2400 kV. These are pretty popular motors, pretty new. Only $10 a piece, so you can't beat the price. So I'm hoping they're going to be good motors. So we're going to use them on here and try them out. I like that the color scheme of the motors kind of matches the standoffs as well. We've also got some Rotor Riot skids we're putting on this one. Those came in a quad box several months back. I just haven't used them yet because it's really, you need a build with a top mount battery to really utilize the skid, so that's why I'm using them here. We also have got some soft mounts for the motors there. We've got the wires for each of our different components. And we've got the gummies there that came with the flight controller just to keep the vibrations out of it. So hopefully we don't have those same twitching issues that the first Maytech F405 did. So we'll see soon enough. Alright guys, so moving on to step 2, we're going to prep our XT60 connector and get that ready to mount to the flight controller. So I'm going to be using some 12 gauge wire on this one. Some people do solder it directly to the flight controller board, but I've seen some issues with that area that sticks off kind of bending or sometimes even breaking if you get in a bad crash or it gets a lot of pressure put on it. So I'm going to be adding in some 12 gauge wire, just a short piece of wire, but just enough that it has a little bit of flexibility, and hopefully that will prevent any breaks or anything like that. So obviously using a razor blade here to trim off the silicone sheathing around the wire. Definitely if you use a razor blade, be careful guys, you don't want to cut yourself, and it's really easy to do. So I just find it's a little bit easier than trying to use scissors or wire cutters or something like that, but definitely be careful if you go that route. Here we're putting a little bit of flux on the wires and getting the solder on there, getting those tinned up ready to attach. Now we're getting ready to do the XT60 soldering at this point, and you noticed I did plug the other side of the XT60 connector in also. The reason I do that is to make sure that it doesn't shrink down on itself or kind of collapse when you're soldering it. I've seen a lot of cases where when that connector gets hot it can kind of shrink down. So if you just go ahead and put the other side in, that'll help prevent that. So we've got our red wire soldered on there, and I'm just trimming up around the edges of it to make sure we can get some heat shrink on it. And again, guys, if you're using a razor blade like this, definitely be careful. It's easy to cut yourself, so I'm definitely using a lot of caution as I'm doing that. Alright, so here we go, soldering on our negative wire. Again, we're adding a little bit of flux on there, and just making sure it's soldered good. You can see I'm using a towel there to clean up the solder joints. I try to do that on all my builds, and anytime I'm soldering and using flux, try to keep that clean. So we've got the wire soldered on, so now we're going to be moving on to the heat shrink. So we're just cutting those down to size. We're going to slide those on. And they were actually a little bit too big. They didn't want to fit down in the connector just perfect, so I just used my soldering iron there to kind of shrink the ends of the heat shrink down just a little bit, and that will get it to actually fit in those holes on the back of the connector better. And once you get them in there in place, you can grab your heat gun and go ahead and heat shrink it. Alright, so checking it out, that looks good. So now we're going to go ahead and prep our capacitor. Some people mount this directly to the battery leads. I actually like to add a little bit of wire to my capacitors, and if I can, I like to get them out away from the actual XT60 connector and move them into the frame somewhere. I think it just kind of looks better and keeps it from hanging out and having the potential to get damaged. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just going to add some wires onto the capacitor, and then we're going to move that into the frame somewhere, which we'll figure out at some point, but definitely just going to get it away so it's not hanging outside the frame or hanging on the outside of the XT60 connector. I didn't actually have another piece of red wire here, so I'm going with blue for the positive lead. Again, that kind of matches the build too, so as much as I can color match, I try to do that. So here we're adding on our heat shrink to the capacitor. Go ahead and heat shrink that down. So that looks good. So now we're going to measure up our XT60 connector, kind of put the board on the frame, see about how high it needs to stick up and where we need to snip those wires. So again, making these really pretty short, but again, the point of the wire is just to give it a little bit of flexibility so they don't need to be real long. And again, using our razor blade to take off a little bit of the sheathing. Just doing a test fit there to make sure they'll line up and be good. And I like to give my wires a twist as well before I do the soldering. That just kind of makes the solder stay on there a little bit cleaner, and it looks a little bit cleaner. So we're getting them twisted now, getting them soldered up. Alright, so moving on to step 4. So yeah, we're going to be test fitting and mounting that XT60 connector. And by test fit, I mean I'm making sure the solder, the areas of the wire that are soldered will fit down into the actual flight controller. It has some slots on the board where the wire is supposed to slide into or where the connector is supposed to slide into. So I'm making sure that my wires will fit down in those slots. I want them to fit in there cleanly. That way we don't have a bunch of nasty wires sticking up or sticking out or anything like that. So again, definitely take your time on this part. The XT60 connector is a crucial part of the flight controller. Again, if you end up with a bad connection, you're going to have issues, or if you've got it on there not very well, then it may end up coming off or something like that. So definitely worth taking your time and making sure it looks good. So again, I measured it with the top plate there as well to make sure it still looked good, which it did. So now we're adding some flux, and we're going to solder on that XT60 connector. Alright, and that looks good. Again, cleaning it up with a towel. Definitely don't want flux going all over the place, or you don't want flux left all over your flight controller. So yeah, the flexibility looks good there. So step 5, we're going to be test fitting and mounting the capacitor. So now I'm kind of just doing a little layout test here and seeing kind of where I can put it. And I'm thinking it would be nice to be able to mount it to one of those standoffs actually. That'll kind of keep it out of the way, especially on this frame as well. You've got quite a bit of build room in there since it's a longer frame. So I'm planning on mounting it to one of those standoffs, and so trimming the wire down to be about that length. And we're going to go ahead and solder the capacitor onto the flight controller. Another nice thing about this flight controller, it actually has two little pads right next to the pads where the battery leads go, where you can actually solder the capacitor to. So it kind of has like two little individual pads for that, which is pretty nice. That's the first flight controller I've ever seen that has it like that. Most of them, you just solder it right onto the battery leads in a lot of cases, so it's nice to see one that has separate little pads for the capacitor. So we've got it soldered on, doing our test fit. It looks like it'll be good, mounting it to one of the standoffs there. Alright, so moving on to step 6, guys, we're going to test fit and prep our ESCs. So at this point, I'm checking the wire length. I want to make sure my wires aren't too long, because really for a clean build, you don't want a lot of excess wire hanging around. So I'm checking my wires, making sure they're going to fit nicely. And I also like to kind of keep my wires on the arms as much as possible. So I'm actually doing one wire on positive and negative longer than the other one, so I can kind of curl that wire around so they both kind of run in the same spot, and then one will actually curve around to get to the pad. And the main reason that's necessary on this flight controller, the ESC pads are on the corner. So sometimes that can be a little bit tricky, getting the wires to them cleanly. But again, if you just take your time, kind of test fit everything beforehand, you should still be able to get a clean build on it. So here I'm stripping down those ESC wires, getting those prepped, adding some solder to them. You'll notice I do not have the ground wire on these ESCs. This flight controller does not actually have a separate pin for the ground, so it only has one for the signal pin. So again, I'm just took the ground wire off at the ESC, and we're not going to be using those. And in most cases, you can get away without using them. I've done that on a lot of builds and haven't had a problem. I know some people say it can be a problem, but I've never had that issue. Alright, so on to step 7, guys. We're actually pre-tinning all the pads on our flight controller. So this is a good time to figure out where everything needs to go, look at the pads. Luckily this board has all the pads labeled, so that makes it really easy to figure it out. But yeah, take your time, figure out where everything needs to go, like your buzzer, your LEDs, your receiver, your ESCs, your signal wires. I mean, there's plenty of things you've got to solder to the flight controller. So take your time, go ahead and pre-tin all those pads and have them ready to go. That way when you start assembling everything, you can just zip around and solder everything to the flight controller at one time. Also, I put flux on the flight controller when I'm doing this, so that can get kind of messy. So I just like to do it all at one time, that I can clean it off good before I actually start soldering on the components. So here we're going around, we've done our ESC pads, we're doing our, like I said, our receiver pad, our VTX pad, our camera pads, our buzzer pad, our LED pads. So several pads here you have to do. Also, something to note, guys, and I didn't realize this at first, but Maytech actually on this flight controller, it can't use the LED controller and the barometer at the same time. And basically what I mean by that, you can't do both at the same time. So you can have it controlling your LEDs, or you can have it controlling your barometer, but not both at the same time. And apparently they share a pad or something like that, is the reason for that. So what I decided to do actually is look up on Maytech's website and see if they had any tips for that, and they did. And of course what their solution is to actually move your LED wire to the signal 5 pad, and then in Betaflight you can actually do some remapping and resource remapping, and you can change it to where the LED is controlled from the signal 5 pad, and again that way you can use both the barometer and the LED controller at the same time. So again, I don't show the resource part of that in the Betaflight setup, but if you guys want to see that, definitely let me know and I'll be happy to make a video on it. So at this point we're getting our components soldered onto the board. So we've done our buzzer there, just did the LED wire. So we're just going to go around to each different component and solder it to the pads that we've already pre-tinned. And again, guys, like I said, this board, it's really easy to do that. They did a great job of labeling the board, making it very clear. so not hard at all to solder on your components. Yeah, guys, and you'll probably notice the solder tip I have on this iron is pretty big actually. This is a Weller 40-watt iron, just one of the $20 ones from Home Depot. I actually really like this iron. It has lights built into it, and it's always worked great for me. But I am using a really big tip, mainly because most of my smaller tips have been eaten up, or they're just not in very good condition anymore. So you can get away with using a bigger tip on something like this, even for the smaller wires. I usually just use the edge of the tip to do portions like this. So it can be done. It just, you have to take your time and be careful with it. Obviously, you don't want to be bridging pads together or anything like that, and not using too much solder. So it can be done. That's another one of the big reasons I use flux. Also, I know there's a lot of solders out there that actually have the flux included in it that are probably better for doing things like this. Again, I just bought my solder from Home Depot, so I picked up some flux as well, and it still works great for me. So we're moving on to soldering on our ESCs now, and you can kind of see there how that red wire is curved around the black and the white wire. So like I said, as I mentioned, I want everything coming off in the same direction, and I also have to make sure I leave room for the screws to come up through the flight controller. So obviously we can't go right in front of those holes. So that's why I'm looping them around kind of behind it. That way everything will still fit on nicely and it'll still be a clean build. Notice I'm using my helping hands there. Definitely makes this process so much easier. If you don't have a helping hand like that, I highly recommend getting one. Just sitting there holding the flight controller the whole time and trying to solder those pads can be super difficult. So again, the helping hand comes in handy a lot of times. I use it pretty much on almost every build now. So definitely recommend picking one up if you don't have one. You can get it on Amazon for probably 20 or 30 bucks. But it definitely does make the build process a lot easier. Notice I've got my Q-tip there as well, so obviously it's hard to get that towel in there sometimes to clean up those little spots. So I like to keep a Q-tip on hand as well, so I can just get in there and clean up any of those flux that's still laying around. Alright guys, and we're still finishing up the ESCs here. Again, this can be a pretty lengthy process getting this portion done. Obviously you've got 4 of them to attach and you want to make sure everything's nice and clean. But we're getting there, almost done with that. Notice I just use my wire cutters as well, so sometimes when you actually go to solder on to some of your pads, you may end up with like a point or something like that sticking up. And obviously you don't want that. I don't want anything sticking up off the flight controller that could short on something. So if you do, when you do your soldering, if you have a point or something sticking up off the pad or off the wire, just grab your wire cutter, snip that off. And alright guys, so at this point we're working on attaching the last signal wire. Trying to get this last ESC attached. And again, definitely take your time on this. Make sure you get them all laid out correctly and wired up correctly. Will definitely save you work later on. If you get your wires to the right length and get everything clean the first time. Here I'm going around with my Q-tip, making sure I've got everything clean. Again, you don't want any excess flux left on the flight controller. Not only does it, just not look good, but it can also gum up and kind of mess your pads up a little bit. So definitely clean that off. Here we're moving on to step 10. So at this point we're going to bind our receiver and we're going to check and make sure all of our components are working. Obviously before you mount everything onto the frame and start finishing the build up, you want to make sure everything's working. If there is something that has to be changed on the wiring or something like that, it's a lot easier to do it at this point than waiting till later and having to do it then, or having to take the frame all back apart again to actually get to something so you can fix it. So again, it's important to test everything before you put the build together. So at this point, I'm plugging up my receiver, I've plugged up my VTX, I've plugged up my camera. So pretty much that everything that plugs in, I've got plugged in now. And we're going to go ahead and get it plugged in and work on binding. So first step there, we're plugging in the USB to the flight controller, and then we're also going to plug the USB into the computer. And the first thing I'm doing here is just checking to see if the receiver powers from just the USB. On some flight controllers, the receiver will turn on just from the USB power. On others, flight controllers, it won't. You actually have to use the battery to get the receiver to turn on. So I'm just checking that first, because obviously if I can get it to turn on with just the USB, that makes it a little bit easier for me. So now I've verified that does work, so I'm going to be using that, using just the USB to get the receiver to turn on. So here we're getting our Tyrannus set up, working on getting a new model created. So we chose multi, we just paged through each of the other options, because again we already have it set on the default setting we need. Here we're going to give it a name, so we're going to call this one Rad-X. And if you guys don't already know this, you can get capital letters on the Tyrannus by just holding down the center button when you press it, and that'll make it a capital letter instead of lowercase. Now for receiver, we're going to be turning off the internal receiver, and we're going to be turning on the external receiver. And again, the reason I'm doing that is because I'm using the FlySky receiver, so I have to use the external iRange module to bind. But again, most people probably be using an FrSky receiver, so in that case you would just leave it on the internal receiver and choose the appropriate settings for your FrSky receiver and kind of go through the same bind process. But again, I'm just using the external receiver because I am using the FlySky X6B receiver. So for that multi-module, we set it to FS2A, and we do PPM SBus. So we're going to go over to the bind button and press bind. And then we want to come over to our receiver, which also has a bind button. And we're going to press the bind button on the receiver. Make sure it's pressed good before plugging it in. Alright, we've just plugged it in, so we see a few beeps on the receiver. That should indicate to us that it's been bound. So I'd like to give it a second. Unplug the USB, exit out of bind mode on your Tyrannus. And what I've found the easiest way to verify the receiver actually did bind is if you just go ahead and connect in Betaflight. You should actually be able to check and see if you've got stick movement on the receiver tab. And that's really the easiest way to check. So the first thing I'm doing here is checking my serial port. So it's already turned on by default on UART2. Making sure I'm set to SBus. So I am serial based and I've got SBus already selected. So then we're going to jump to the receiver tab, and if I just move the sticks on the Tyrannus, I should see movement. And we do. So that tells me the receiver's been bound. Alright, so at that point we're going to disconnect out of Betaflight. Again, that's one of the main things we needed to verify before we continue with the build process and start putting everything in the frame. Now the other thing we also want to check at this point is to make sure that our VTX and our camera is working also. Because again, if those things aren't working, that's something that's going to need to be addressed before we put the build together. So here I'm actually going to be using a smoke stopper. You can pick these up from race day quads, or at least you could. I've got this from there a while back, but I've used it a lot. And really this is just the smoke stopper is supposed to help prevent any kind of shorts or anything if there is something wrong with your wiring. The smoke stopper should blow instead of it hurting your flight controller. So again, we plug in our battery to it. We can see the green light on the smoke stopper. So we are going to plug that into our XT60 connector. Hope there's no magic smoke or anything. And then we'll verify that everything's working. So we see our LEDs light up. That's a good sign. We hear the buzzer beep, which is also a good sign. We can see the VTX is turned on. Also a good sign. So now I want to check and make sure the camera's working. So for that I'm going to use my little Spectrum screen here. Again, we're just going to flip it on. We already have it set on the right channel for that VTX. So again, we can see I've got picture there. So you can see the camera. So that tells us everything is working. Again, we don't have to get everything set up right now, but at this point we're just verifying that, hey, our wiring's right, our components are working, so now we can proceed with the build process. And the last thing we're going to check is in BOHeli to make sure it is actually reading all of our ESCs. And again, this is something else you want to check before you put the build together, because if maybe you've got a bad ESC or you've got one that's not reading, obviously you don't want to get the whole build put together and then realize that. And I've done that before, so I know how it feels. So again, I'm just plugging in to the computer again, checking BOHeli, and I can see that it has 4 ESCs listed. So that tells me that it's reading each one. So we should be good to go with that, and we've verified that all of our components are working. Alright guys, so our next step, we're getting close to being ready to put everything in the frame. Step 11, we're just going to add some heat shrink to the capacitor. And again, I'm going to be attaching this to one of the standoffs, so it's going to be metal on the capacitor. There's also potential for the capacitor to actually come in contact with the carbon fiber. So again, I want to add as much protection as I possibly can. So I'm going to add some heat shrink on the capacitor. Here I'm just cutting out a little slot on it for the wires, and basically I'm going to kind of bend the wires underneath the capacitor, set it down parallel with the standoff, and then just hopefully use a zip tie to hold it to one of the standoffs. So here I'm trying to go a little bit lower with the heat shrink and make sure it's kind of sticking down on the bottom of the capacitor. And again, that'll just help us make sure that it's not coming in contact with carbon fiber or anything like that. So obviously guys, using a heat gun can be dangerous. You can see how close it is to my hand there. They do get really hot, so if you're using a heat gun, definitely be careful with it. I use mine on the low setting all the time. I really have never found a need to put it on the high setting. For any kind of heat shrink that we're going to be using for quads or anything like that, the low setting works just fine. So I definitely recommend keeping it on the low setting if it has one. But again, guys, just definitely be careful. Obviously, when you're doing these builds, soldering and cutting things and heat shrinking things, there's a lot of potential to harm yourself and to have an issue. So take your time, be careful, and you'll come out with a clean build. Alright, so now I'm just checking, making sure the heat shrink is stuck on there good. Just pushing down on the end a little bit, making sure it's stuck to the bottom of the capacitor good. Again, that's one of the main areas I'm trying to protect, make sure it doesn't come in contact with the carbon fiber. Step 12, we're going to do the same with our LEDs and heat shrink those. For now, I'm actually going to be probably mounting the LEDs just on the bottom of the frame. I don't have a tail light mount or anything like that printed yet, so more than likely I'm just going to be mounting it to the inside of the frame right now. So definitely you don't want the bottom of those pads on the LED coming in contact with the carbon fiber. So just adding some heat shrink to that as well. Obviously using clear heat shrink, so we'll still be able to see the LEDs. So step 13, we're going to be test fitting the buzzer and the capacitor. And again, the main thing there, we want to put our flight controller stack actually on the screws and just kind of figure out where everything's going to go. Obviously, before I start attaching screws and fastening the flight controller down, I need to make sure that everything's going to fit right and fit correctly. So again, I'm just doing that quick test fit with a buzzer or capacitor. I'm feeling like I'm going to go to the front of the flight controller actually with those, since there's two standoffs right next to it, right in front of the where the flight controller sits. Kind of a perfect spot to put those, so kind of got those laid there about where they're going to be. Moving on to step 14, we're going to attach our components to the frame. So I'm actually doing the flight controller now. I've got my rubber grommets installed on the flight controller. Again, I'm just adding some little plastic nuts on top of the flight controller to hold it down. Using my pliers there to tighten them up a little bit, just make sure they're snug. I'm going to be adding another little screw or a little nut onto the back side of the flight controller stack. And again, luckily our receiver is stackable, so that'll help make a clean build. So I've got those screws, 2 screws on the back actually, and that should give us enough clearance that our receiver doesn't come in contact with the flight controller. Now at this point I'm working on getting our LEDs fastened, so for that I'm just going to be using a couple zip ties on the back. So I get them positioned about where I want them, get the zip ties tightened up well to hold those LEDs on. Alright, now before we do the rest of it, we're also going to attach the capacitor and the buzzer. And again, we're attaching these to standoff, so this can be a little touchy. Take your time, just make sure you get the zip tie on there good, and it should hold everything in place well. So we've got the buzzer done there, and we're just doing the capacitor on the other side. Again, I added some tape to the bottom of the capacitor on top of the heat shrink also, just to make sure that nothing comes in contact with the carbon fiber. So now we're getting our receiver mounted, just getting it plugged in, getting it attached. Again, we're going to be using the same little nuts to hold it down. Now one kind of weird thing on this receiver, on the other side there, it actually has a little LED that's really close to the mounting hole, and you can actually use a full-size screw there. It kind of hits that LED and could potentially knock it off. So what I do is actually use my razor blade and I just trim down one of the screws so it can clear that. But that is something to be aware of on the FlySky X6B receiver. So now we're moving on to step 15. We're going to be attaching the VTX to the camera, or excuse me, attaching the VTX to the top plate and putting the camera on. So now for this VTX, obviously I want to be able to change my channels without taking the quad apart. So I'm actually mounting the VTX kind of upside down. So the back of the VTX is going to be against the bottom of the top plate. That way the LED and the button will actually be facing down towards the inside of the quad. So that way if I need to change my channel or something like that, I should just be able to look inside the quad there and get to the button to make the change. Again, I'm using a whip antenna on this VTX. I actually prefer whip antennas. They have always worked great for me, you know, as far as I fly. And again, I don't like really don't like the big clunky antennas. They tend to break a lot, or if you crash, you know, they're just vulnerable a lot. You know, these little whip antennas can move around, so they stay where they're supposed to be. You know, if you get in a crash or something, they just bend right back. So I've had really good experience with them. And again, I don't do any long distance flying or anything like that, so they've always been great for me. So you just saw we attached the camera there as well, so we just plugged it in. Got some 3D printed camera mounts that I'm using. Just found those on Thingiverse and printed them off on my Monoprice Mini. So we just got that added. We're also adding in our battery straps before we mount this top plate. And again, just a good idea to do that beforehand before you mount it. You can still get the straps through the top plate even if it's mounted, but again, it's a lot more difficult to pull them through there and just a little bit tougher to navigate. So again, we're getting that set up before we mount it. Now we're just grabbing our mounting screws for the top plate, and we're just going to run around to each one, tighten them up, and we'll be one step closer to getting this thing ready. Alright, and guys, definitely be careful not to over tighten those screws. You want them tight, but you definitely don't want to over tighten them. Always a good idea to use some Loctite too. Usually I kind of do my build first and make sure it works before I start adding Loctite, just in case I have to take it apart or something or work on it. So moving on to step 16, guys, we're going to be heat shrinking our ESCs. So again, at this point I'm grabbing some more of my clear heat shrink and I'm just adding that to the ESCs. Now the way I do this, and it's the way a lot of ESCs come factory, or the way they come by default, is they use clear heat shrink, but they leave the motor pads exposed, so you can still solder the motors on without actually removing the heat shrink. So these actually had been modified a little bit, so they didn't have the original clear heat shrink. So I basically just added that back on. So moving on to step 17, guys, we're going to be soldering our motors to the ESCs, and we're going to be attaching the motors to the frame. So obviously, guys, this is quite a little bit of a lengthy process. You've got 4 motors to do. Definitely helping hands comes in super handy here. It makes it a lot easier to do this. But yeah, we're going to zip around, do all 4 motors, then work on mounting those. And again, we've got our rotor riot skids we're going to be using and our soft mounts. So adding those in too makes it a little bit harder to get all the screws lined up. But again, we're just, got to get through it for each motor. Also important, make sure you check the length of your screws that you're using to hold your motors before you actually start tightening those down and putting them on. And the reason for that, guys, if your screws get up into your motor, or they actually get up to the point of being able to touch the windings in the motor, you can cause shorts. It can cause all kinds of issues. Can just destroy your motors, can send a short through your frame and destroy other components. So definitely pay attention to that. Luckily, these DYS motors are naked bottom, so with naked bottom motors, it's really easy to see how far the screw has actually gone into the frame, or how far the screw has gone into the motor. But again, on some of the older style closed bottom motors, that's not an option, and you can't really see how far the screw has gone. So definitely take your time doing that. Make sure you don't over tighten it or screw it up into the motor. And again, usually what I do is I stick my screw through the frame beforehand, or in this case, I'll stick it through my rotor riot skid, through the soft mount, and through the frame, and see how much is actually coming out of the frame. So you want it to be just enough to get a good bite on the motor, but you don't want it to be so much that it's going to, like I said, actually go up and hit the windings of the motor. And you notice, guys, here on each motor, I'm cutting the wires down just a little bit. So again, I've kind of got my ESCs laid out in the length of those wires so they land about the middle of the arms. And again, I just like doing that because it makes for a clean build. So obviously I don't want a bunch of motor wire, sticking out the side or moving all over the place or have it curled up or anything like that. So I'm taking my time to check the length of the motor wires, cut those down to size so they should attach to the ESCs cleanly, and everything should lay there on the arms nice and neat. Alright guys, I'm finally moving on to the last motor here. Again, this is a little bit of a lengthy process, so definitely take your time. Just make sure you get it done right. Again, better to do it right the first time than have to go back and redo something. Alright, so we've got that last motor soldered on, so now we're moving on to adding the screws, getting our rotor riot skids and our soft mounts on there as well, getting that last motor attached. Alright, so that looks good. So now we're moving on to step 18, guys. We're going to be flashing our firmware. And again, you don't have to do this necessarily. This was actually a new flight controller, but as a best practice, I like to go ahead and flash my flight controllers. As soon as I get a new one. A lot of times they may come with a little bit older version than actually is what's currently out from Betaflight. So again, I just like to flash it to the latest version. And again, that's pretty easy in Betaflight. Just hold the boot button on your flight controller. When you plug it in, you'll see DFU appear in the upper right corner, or you should see DFU. If you don't, you may need to work on your drivers. But again, once you get DFU, just go to Flash Firmware, choose your version, hit Flash, and it should do it for you. Once it's finished flashing, again, should just reboot the flight controller, then you can connect in Betaflight as you saw there. One thing, when you saw the quad moving, I always like to check my gyro when I first get in Betaflight. So again, if you just move the quad, you should see that little picture moving. If you don't, then obviously you've got a problem, or if you don't see the gyro light in the upper right corner, then you have a problem also. So definitely important to check that. So now we're doing our flight controller setup. I'm going to be running D-Shot, so I'm choosing D-Shot. And we're just going to go through each of the different settings in here, make sure we've got everything set up right. I am going to be running reverse props, so I'm going to switch on reverse props. Go ahead and set your PID loop frequency however you want it to be. Alright guys, and here I'm pointing out that we've got the barometer and the accelerometer light up at the top right. Usually Betaflight also has the magnetometer turned on, but again, this flight controller doesn't have one. I've never actually had a flight controller that has the magnetometer, so we're going to switch that off. We're verifying that we've got serial receiver set. We've already got S-Bus selected. Here I'm choosing the features I want for my flight controller, so I'm going to be turning on LED strip, OSD, anti-gravity, and we're also going to be doing the dynamic filtering. Also make sure you set your small underscore angle over on the right side. That needs to be set to 180, and again that's so you can flip the quad or arm the quad in any orientation. So let's say you get stuck in a tree or something, you don't want to be in a situation where you can't arm it and not, maybe get it down. So it's good to set that to 180. There on the buzzer I turned off most of those, and again the main reason for that, I don't want my quad beeping at me when the battery gets low or anything like that. I have the OSD, so I watch my battery voltage through OSD, so I don't need all those buzzer things turned on. So again, I turn off most of those. So notice the picture changed a bit on the flight controller. Now it shows a little rectangle block or whatever, and that's fine. So we just checked our power and battery tab. Those are on the default settings, which again, those are fine. Here we're going to the PID tuning page, and really all I need to change here, I'm going to be setting my rates the way I want and my expo the way I want. So I usually run 1.2 for my RC rate on pitch, roll, and yaw, and I run 0.4 expo for all those as well. Then we're going to flip over to the filter settings. We're going to turn off all the filters, or the notch filters and the D-term filter. And again, obviously check your motors when you go to fly it. If they're not getting hot or anything, then that should be fine to have all those turned off. And that's really what the dynamic filtering does. You switch those filters off, and I guess it flies better from the way I understand it, but that's just my typical setup, and it works well. So step 20 here, guys, we're adjusting our center points and our end points on our Tyrannus. So if you can see on the receiver tab there, a lot of my midpoints were up around like 1520 or something like that. So obviously that's wrong. The midpoint needs to be 1500, the low or the minimum needs to be 1000, and the maximum needs to be 2000. So I'm basically going through my Tyrannus, and I'm going to each one of those different outputs, and I'm adjusting those settings to get those balanced out so they're correct as far as the midpoint, the minimum, and the maximum. And I'm going to do that for throttle, pitch, roll, and yaw. Notice the auxiliary switches are also that way, where they're not exactly perfect, but again, the auxiliary switches aren't so important that you need to adjust those, but we do want to adjust the others. So here, step 21, we're setting up our modes. So again, I just put my arm on an auxiliary switch. I put angle mode and horizon mode on a auxiliary switch. I'm also going to be turning on the beeper. Also put that on a switch, and I turn on flip over after crash, or what most people know as turtle mode. So I turn that on as well, and again that just allows me to flip over after crash. And the last thing I turn on is air mode there. And again, I put air mode basically up on the high end of my mode switch. So basically I'm only using air mode when I'm going to be in acro mode. I do not use the air mode if I'm in stabilized or horizon mode. And I really don't use stabilized or horizon mode very much at all. Mainly the only time I would ever use those is if I'm maybe flying line of sight, or I'm just testing the quad or something like that. I may use them for that. But again, I still like to have them on there. So moving on to step 22, guys, we're going to be checking our motor direction. So to do this, we go to the motors tab, we plug in our battery, and we're basically going to check the direction that each motor is spinning and make sure it's correct for our reverse prop direction. Now the easiest way to do this, you turn on the acknowledgement that the props are off, and then you're going to click on each one of the little motor sliders, and I actually use the arrow key just to bump it up to like 2. And that will actually get the motor to start spinning just a little bit. And again, we're just going to check the direction and see if they're right. So there, notice we just have one wrong. So I believe here motor 2 and 3 are going the wrong direction. So we're going to have to fix those in BL Heli. I believe motor 1 and 4 were going the correct direction. But the main thing here, guys, definitely use the arrow keys. Just click on the little slider, hit the arrow key a couple times. That way the motor just starts spinning a little bit. You don't need to run it all the way up or anything like that. Also, obviously, make sure you have your props off before you do anything like that. Obviously, they're seeing, all kinds of pictures and videos out there of people where they've accidentally armed or accidentally ran a slider up and, they cut their hands or cut their face or something like that. So anytime you're doing something like that, guys, make sure the props are off. So here we are connected in BL Heli, and again we're fixing the motor direction on motors 2 and 3. We're the ones going the wrong direction, so we're switching those around. Then we're also adjusting the sliders here for our maximum and minimum. So again, we're just setting it to 1,000 and 2,000. And again, sometimes it can be hard to get these sliders on the exact spots you want them to land on. Which again, if you have that issue, if you actually just hold down your mouse button on the slider, you can also actually use the arrow keys to move them around. And again, that makes it a little bit easier to get it exactly where you want it. Alright guys, so we've got our settings there the way we want them, so we're going to go ahead and hit right setup. Now something else we want to do here is flash our ESCs. I like using the D-Shot command, so for turtle mode or for startup tones or any of those features, you have to be on a version of BL Heli that supports D-Shot commands. So for me, that's been the 16.66, 16.67. So I just hit flash all, I choose that version. Typically it will have D-Shot commands next to the version in parentheses. So I'm going to choose that and hit flash all, and then we saw it go through each one of the ESCs and flash them. Now here I'm setting my beacon strength or the beep strength to 91. And the reason I do that is I want the Star Wars startup tone, and that's actually how you get it through BL Heli. So once you get on a flash to a version that does support D-Shot commands, you can choose numbers 91 through 96 on your beep strength, and that will give you different startup tones. So I actually choose 91 because that's the Star Wars tone, and that's the one I prefer. So moving on to the next step, guys. Step 24, we're going to configure our OSD settings. Now something super nice in this newest version of Betaflight, they have actually set the default where all that stuff is turned off except for warnings, which is pretty cool because in the past all those different options were on and you had to go through and manually turn each one of them off. And I'm pretty sure most people don't use most of them. So it's nice now that the default is actually to have them turned off, and then you can just choose the ones you want turned on. So for this quad, I'm just going to keep it basic. I want my main battery voltage. I want my call sign. I want the flight timer, timer 2 actually, so I just want to see the flight minutes, how long I've actually been armed. And the other thing we're going to turn on for this flight controller is altitude. So again, because we have the barometer on this one, we actually can see the altitude. Not sure how well it's going to work yet, but it should show us altitude. So we're going to turn that option on as well. Over on the right side, we're going to set the units to the opposite of what it was actually on. I believe it's called imperial, and again, that's so it shows us the altitude in feet opposed to meters. So you just switch that there. And we can also choose our in-flight statistics that we want. So again, we're going to turn off anything there that's not really relevant to the features we have turned on. We're going to get those set correctly, and then we'll save that. And by default, guys, sometimes the screen size may not look right, or if say I'm looking at it through my screen, you may not be seeing everything that you actually see on the Betaflight window. That's because the version that's selected isn't correct. So sometimes if it's on automatic, it's not right. So for most cases, if I'm running, a Foxeer camera or I'm running a RunCam camera or something like that, it needs to be set to NTSC, I believe it is. But again, yeah, you can just change that right there in Betaflight. And that will change the size of the screen so everything fits on there like you want. Notice I'm looking at my FPV screen there, so again I'm just making sure everything is where it's supposed to be and everything looks correct. And here we're setting those in-flight statistics I was talking about. Alright guys, so at this point I'm actually working on getting the camera's OSD little control wire sticking out of the quad. And the reason I'm doing that is by default these cameras have several things turned on, like your call sign, your battery voltage, and the timer. So obviously all the flight controller is giving me all those options through the OSD. So I don't need to have two of those turned on. So right now what I'm doing is just plugging in that little controller that comes with the camera. And again, I'm just going to go into the menu and I'm going to turn off each one of those options because again, we don't need them through the camera since the OSD is providing those for us. So here you can see we're going back to our FPV screen. I'm just going to hold down the up arrow on the OSD controller for the camera. And we can scroll through each of the options and we're just going to go through and shut those off. Exit and save. And that's good. Get all those turned off. So now we're going to unplug our battery, disconnect that OSD controller, and I'm just putting that back in the container it goes in. Obviously those are super handy, or maybe sometimes say you're flying at night or something, you may actually need to change the settings on your camera so it works better for not flying at night. So I do keep those in my box with all my quad stuff. I have one for both Fox here and one for RunCam. So again, I keep each one of those in just a little case with some extra prop nuts and things like that. So again, if I'm out in the field and maybe I lose a prop nut, or maybe I need to change something or change a camera setting, always nice to have those parts on hand, and again, doesn't take up a lot of room, so I just keep those in a little case and keep those in my box with all my quads. Alright guys, so at this point we're plugging it back in. There's one more thing that I actually want to change before we get ready to fly this thing. So we're going to reconnect in Betaflight. We're going to jump back to the OSD tab, and we're actually going to change the font. And I like using the Clarity font in Betaflight. And it actually makes the font a little bit bigger than what it normally is, and it looks a little bit different, but to me it looks cleaner and it's more readable. So once you choose your font, hit save, it's going to upload it, your flight controller is going to reboot, and then on my FPV screen I can look and verify that it does show the correct font. Alright guys, so we're basically there. We've got all of our settings done now, pretty much set up ready to fly. So coming up on our last steps here, so step 25, we're going to tape the ESCs and we're going to attach our props. Now yes, I could have just zip tied my ESCs down. I don't really like doing that. I prefer to use electrical tape and really cover up those wires and cover up the ESCs with the tape. And really I've had the best experience with that. When I've had just the wires there, sometimes I've seen them get cut, maybe a prop gets bent down, or maybe you just run into a tree and a stick comes along and can rip one of your wires off. So I've just had a better experience on most of my quads by actually taping those ESCs down good. I actually crashed one into water also, and all the ESCs actually survived, even though it sat underwater for a good probably 10 minutes. And again, I attribute a lot of that to the tape, because I had those ESCs taped down. I kept the water from getting in there really, and again saved those ESCs. So I definitely recommend taping those down. And again, you can use colors and make it colorful. I just usually use black most of the time just to kind of match the arms, but still looks clean. And we've got our grass cutter props on there. So again, those came in the April quad box also. So just fitting to put those on this quad. So we've got those attached. Now we're on to step 26, guys, which is going to be a line of sight flight. Again, I'm just run outside my house, after finishing up the build. And the main thing I want to do here is just do like a hover test to make sure it's not twitching all over the place like the first Maytech all-in-one board did. Make sure it's flying right, make sure it doesn't sound weird. Check the motor temperature when you land, make sure all that looks okay, or the motors aren't getting too hot. So definitely before I get out in the field and I really start ripping this thing around FPV, I just want to kind of test everything just in the yard to make sure it works correctly. So that's what we're doing here. Again, there I'm just doing some little throttle pumps. And on the first version of the Maytech flight controller, the Maytech flight controller, the F405 all-in-one, when you did those throttle pumps like that, in most cases you would start getting yaw twitches all over the place, like your quad would just sit there and try to yaw itself around. And that was actually because the gyro on that original Maytech board was too sensitive. So if you didn't have a capacitor on each one of your ESCs, or maybe a humongous capacitor on the battery or something like that, yeah, it just had all kinds of crazy twitching problems. Not only that, but it had to be like super soft mounted too, which is just really not a good flight controller. I still have one actually that's gonna sit in the parts bin forever just because it was so bad. And really that was the only horrible thing about it, was just the gyro was too sensitive, but obviously that's a deal breaker for most people. But yeah, this one's working great, guys. Luckily, seems like Maytech got their act together, put the good gyro on this one, and it's working great, which is awesome. So again, I just did some flips there, just making sure everything's fine. Everything looked good, didn't see any issues, flying smooth. So we're going to bring it in for a landing. So at this point, yeah, feeling great, guys. So we've tested it, it's working out. So now we're finally going to get to that FPV fight. We're going to rip some skies to the last step of the build process. So flying at my favorite park here, guys. Obviously got the low-hanging tree right here. Swing sets, play set. So this is definitely a fun little spot to fly and rip around. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. We'll cut to some music and watch the final flight.